Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. There is a reason why I've used that prog rock reference, and we'll get to that in a couple of moments. Today I thought I would talk to you about a few albums that I've picked up recently. These are all eBay purchases, and there's a reason why I bought them, beyond the fact that I wanted them, obviously. And that is that several years ago I had a bit of a disaster which involved a terrible flood from a burst water pipe that spilled down over the bookcase in the corner of my room in my old house, which was the one that was housing all my records, alongside a few books as well, but mainly records. And a large number of them were damaged beyond repair. So after having these sitting around for a few years in a bag, wondering what to do with them, I finally decided that the time had come to do the replacement that I had been so nicely paid for by my insurance. So I've purchased 3 records that were destroyed. The original records, or at least their sleeves, I'm afraid have gone into the bin, and I know what you're probably thinking, but believe me, there was no salvaging these. The front covers were just stuck together in some cases, so you would try and peel them apart and everything would tear. It wasn't anything that could be salvaged, even as a piece of artwork, even as something, to pass on to collectors. It was just entirely pointless. They'd gone, they were destroyed, they were ruined. So I've done some replacements, and I thought I would share those with you today. The first of these is Hammer Presents Dracula with Christopher Lee. So it's a horrifying story of vampirism with spine-chilling sounds and music. Music by James Bernard, arranged and conducted by Philip Martell. So, very much the Hammer music crew. Now, the version of this I got in the early 1980s. I can't quite remember when it was, maybe 81, 82. It had been a Christmas present for my parents. And there must have been some kind of reissue, because it was basically just a regular sleeve disc. It wasn't the gatefold edition, which this is. So, I've actually upgraded with this purchase. So as you can see here, the gatefold opens up quite nicely to a picture of Mr. Lee in all his splendour from the Satanic Rites of Dracula, which at this point was the latest Dracula film to come out from Hammer. And a whole piece from Basil Copper about the history of Dracula, basically, all the way back to Vlad the Impaler, and a little bit about the films. So this is an odd record if you're unfamiliar with it. It was quite controversial at the time, because this was, I think, the first of the Hammer soundtracks. There hadn't really been any soundtrack albums. There'd been a few single releases, but this was the first of the albums. And rather than being an actual movie soundtrack that soundtrack collectors like, it was a short story, pretty much inspired by Dracula, Prince of Darkness, written by who was it? Written by Don Howden, who had written obviously the later Dracula films as well. Narrated by Christopher Lee. It's actually pretty good. I really like it. It's a good spooky story, but I can imagine that if you were not in the market for that kind of thing, I know obviously that the editor of Little Shop of Horrors was aghast at both this and the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires soundtrack album. There is 2 sides of narration, because some people just want to listen to the music. I'm less interested, but it's for me it's a good album. It's a good little Halloween piece, if you like. The second side of the LP is less interesting, actually. It's a mix of musical suites, so not even the main theme, but just like a combination of the entire soundtrack for Fear in the Night, She, The Vampire Lovers, and Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, which I think you will agree is a bit of an odd selection. Fear in the Night is a psycho thriller. She is an extravagant fantasy. It's not a horror film by any stretch of the imagination, so why include it on a Dracula LP? Very odd indeed. Nevertheless, for people who like Hammer soundtracks, for people who like James Bernard, even though he only wrote one of these pieces, which is the music for She, the rest of it's by John McCabe, Harry Robinson and David Whittaker. So anyway, let's have a quick look at the record itself. You see there with the blue EMI label. I'm trying not to actually touch it. I have to say that I haven't played any of these yet because I don't know if we've mentioned this, but we're in the middle of rearranging this room and still haven't connected up the record player yet. Or at least we haven't connected up the speakers. You might have noticed that there's a little bit of damage there on the sleeve. It's coming loose, but that's nothing. Easily glued down. Now, I did keep the previously owned records just in case, so that I have another option. I mean, God knows how this will play. It looks pretty shocking, but it just needs a clean up. But as you'll see, this one has a red EMI label. I mean, it's still got a 1974 copyright to Hammer City Records. But anyway, there's two versions to pick from, should one of them be no good. One of the vinyl records that was destroyed beyond use, I'm afraid, was the next one, which I finally have a nice copy of. My previous copy of this album was actually not in very good condition to begin with, so this is quite a nice replacement. Son of Dracula. Son of Dracula was the 1974 film that was made by, I say made by, but it was directed by Freddie Francis, who's made lots of horror films, but it's essentially a film made by Ringo Starr and his rock star friends. So this album used to be everywhere in the 1970s, as I recall from being a little kid. You couldn't move without seeing it in any kind of record shops. The film itself just vanished without trace because it is quite awful if you've ever seen it. It's just self-indulgent rock star nonsense of the very worst kind. But the album is great. I mean, musically, it's a mixed bag. They do manage the film starred Harry Nilsson, and they do manage to cram Harry Nilsson's big hit "Without You" into the soundtrack here. I can't recall if it's even on the film, to be honest. I'm sure it must be. I'm sure they would have crammed it into the film as well. But anyway, it's here alongside a bunch of other tracks. So there's little bits of dialogue and music that's all quite forgettable. It's not the best work from anybody involved. That includes Nilsson, Ringo Starr, George Harrison. Who else is on here? Peter Frampton, Ray Cooper, Chris Spedding. Big name stars playing on this album. But I imagine it was more fun to make than it is to listen to. But it's a nice package, as you might be seeing here. It folds out to give you this nice cover with artwork from the movie, the only thing anyone would have ever seen from the movie, generally. Opens up at the top here, and it's on the fairly obscure Rapple label, which is because it was going to come out as an Apple soundtrack. The film is an Apple production, but Nilsson was under contract with RCA, who didn't want it coming out under a different label's name, and so there was a bit of a compromise. You know, take the R from RCA and the Apple from Apple, and you get Rapple. This is the only release on the Rapple label, so collectible in that sense, I suppose, for Beatles fans. But, you know, it's a nice thing to have. I don't really see myself listening to this very often. I haven't listened to it very often in the past, but you know, my life feels better for having it in it, so that's good. And finally, and now we come back to the reference that I made earlier, Inferno, the Inferno soundtrack. Now, I bought the Inferno soundtrack, I think, like Christmas 1980 when I was a kid, and at that point, I'd never heard of Keith Emerson. I don't think I'd really heard of Dario Argento. I might have read one article about him in a horror magazine. Certainly wasn't at all familiar with his films. This sold itself to me on the basis of this cover, the film artwork, which is fantastic, as you all know, and I loved it. I thought it was a great soundtrack. It's a soundtrack that mixes very classical sounds with what I would later become familiar with as prog rock. I think, dare I say it, it's a more adventurous soundtrack than Goblin's Suspiria. It's not as good, but it's certainly, you know, it's certainly a credible piece. Interestingly, the album sells itself as a Keith Emerson solo album more than a film soundtrack. Probably because the film didn't get that wider release outside of Italy, unlike Suspiria. It was kind of buried by 20th Century Fox. So you can see that on the back cover there's a photo of Keith Emerson, a smaller photo as well with him, with Dario Argento. And in the gatefold you get a quite unnecessarily large picture of Emerson stroking his chin, which, quite honestly, I don't know this. I don't think we really needed that, but there we go. And the album itself, let's have a quick look. Yeah, the Atlantic soundtrack, so it's the same as the previous one that I had in Always. Apart from the fact that I somehow childishly peeled off the Atlantic label from the back, because it's actually on the Areola label, and Atlantic obviously did, you know, it's a German record basically, and then was imported. So I do still have the original album. I won't bother showing you that because it's exactly the same. But there we go. So that's 3 bits of my record collection replaced. I can't tell you how awful this flood situation was, and some of the albums that were completely destroyed, both in terms of vinyl and cover, particularly cover. It's just heartbreaking. You know, the original Dawn of the Dead soundtrack, the Dunwich Horror soundtrack, which, you know, obviously I've looked these up to replace them, and they're a tad expensive. So what else did I lose? my original Deep Throat soundtrack. You know, I still have a couple of other versions of that, but the one from the early 70s has gone. It's just so much stuff, and there's plenty of other albums that, you know, I've managed to hold on to, but the sleeves are buckled, they're bent. Hopefully the vinyl is okay. You know, I need to really go through that and check them, but it's heartbreaking enough to lose the ones that were just beyond salvation, so I certainly don't want to throw any away that I don't need to, even if it means just keeping them and not having them as playable options. I mean, obviously some of this stuff has been reissued. There are other versions of Inferno out there. Hammer Presents Dracula has certainly had a few issues. Most recently it was reissued for a Record Store Day special edition on blood red vinyl. So, you know, Record Store Day discs, as you know, can be more expensive than the originals, but it does mean that this is available in various versions if you want to pick it up yourself, and you definitely should. It's also out there online, so you can have a quick listen to it if you're unsure about the short story. But believe me, it's a good horror tale, and if you're into audiobooks and things like that, then I think you will enjoy it. So that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.